On this Thursday night,
it made me sick. It really made me cry.
Heartbroken parents and questions about trucker training. Our investigation looks for accountability from the top.
Nothing else in the universe matters but what's right in front of those guys.
A descent so heart-stopping, astronauts have a name for it: ballistic. Reaction from the Canadian who's been there and who's trained for that.
That last part of his life, yeah, very proud, very proud.
And documenting Gord Downie's final year, how he lived, what he created, a work of brotherly love. This is The National.
Ever since a novice truck driver collided with the Humboldt Broncos team bus, the trucking industry has been under a lot of scrutiny, particularly when it comes to training. Our colleagues at CBC Marketplace tested what it takes to get a license in some provinces, and then, as David Common reports, put a new driver's skills to the test.
Driver inexperience has often been a key cause of truck accidents, and yet across Canada, only Ontario requires new drivers to take any training, 100 hours of it. It's specific and rigorous. In the wake of the Humboldt Broncos crash with a novice driver at the wheel of the colliding truck, Alberta is now also adding mandatory training, something trucking associations say should be nationwide. Russ Harold lost his son Adam in the crash. What did the RCMP tell you about the driver and the company?
Well, they told us that it was the truck driver's first trip alone. It made me sick. It really made me cry.
CBC Marketplace investigated just how easy it is to become a heavy hauler.
Heath, I'm David. Nice to meet you, Dave.
Yeah. Heath Mugley helped us. Wearing a hidden camera, he went to truck school in Saskatchewan, even though the province, like nearly all of Canada, does not require training. A week later, he got his license. But then we put his training to the test, this time with Carroll Dorey in Ontario, a much stricter province. Heath couldn't uncouple a trailer.
There you go.
Nearly hit a pickup on a turn.
Oh, watch that truck.
And had the examiner pull the emergency brake at this intersection.
Whoa.
She wasn't impressed.
Heath got his license in Saskatchewan after doing training that he didn't have to do. If he'd done what he did today in Ontario,
For a drive test?
would he have passed?
No.
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 What does it say to you then that he got his license?
It blows my mind. It's just plainly not safe to be on the road to do something like that.
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
Many groups are now calling for federal action, setting mandatory training, minimum training hours, and much stronger standards. And the feds agree.
I do support minimum entry-level standards for training across the country.
Across the country.
Across the country.
You think it's necessary?
I think it is necessary.
And if you think it's necessary, the federal government does in fact have the authority to do this. You're choosing not to exercise that power. Why is that?
I have a very good relationship with my provincial counterparts. It is my hope that they will all see things the same way with respect to training.
David Common joins me now. It's so interesting, David. You hear the federal minister there wanting action, but seemingly not wanting to commit to it. So how did that land for the people who are demanding change?
That's exactly what we wanted to know, Adrian. And so we went to Russell Harold. You just saw him in that story. His son was one of those Humboldt Broncos players who was killed in the crash. And we showed him what the federal transport minister had to say. It's best just to look at his reaction.
I think that's political posturing.
What do you think the holdup is?
I don't know what the holdup is. Get moving with this.
Make this a priority.
Make this a priority. Make saving lives a priority. Lives are hanging in the balance, and we're talking about timelines. Why would we wait until somebody else dies on the highway?
I mean, it's fairly clear there, Adrian. Russ just wants someone to do something. Provincial, federal, he doesn't really care as long as it's done. And he says a year should not pass from the Humboldt crash before action is taken.
Right. Okay, David Common, thanks very much. If you want to see the entire episode, please do. It will be airing tomorrow night at 8 p.m. on CBC Television.
Here's what else we're working on tonight on The National. A royal stand. Prince William gives an emotional speech calling out wildlife poachers. Coming up, an inside look at just how lucrative the UK's illegal wildlife trade is.
Plus, from male energy to the freshest Air Force One, Kanye West goes outside the box in the Oval Office. Why the lunch with the president matters in our moment.
But first, it was all systems go today for a Russian Soyuz rocket headed for the International Space Station. But 50 kilometers up, a sudden major malfunction. One that sent the two-man crew plummeting back to Earth on a harrowing high-speed trajectory. And if that wasn't enough, as the CBC's Chris Brown reports from Moscow, it all leaves the next mission, as well as a Canadian astronaut, in limbo.
Everything about today's Soyuz launch seemed to bode well.
2, 1.
Starting with a successful ignition, as American Nick Hague and Russian Alexei Ovchinin flew into the blue Kazakhstan sky. But then, just under 2 minutes in, the booster rockets failed, triggering an automatic emergency mission abort. The men's descent module separated from the rest of the rocket, but rather than a slow, controlled ride back to Earth, they did what's called a ballistic descent, much steeper, faster, and a much rougher ride, say those who've trained for it.
It's like shooting a bullet out of a rifle barrel. The crew would have experienced just a fairly benign amount of rotation, about 6 to 7 times Earth's gravity, which is not insignificant.
The men made it to the ground in good shape and later got some precautionary medical attention. The Soyuz launch is a high-profile failure for what has been Russia's most reliable space technology for decades. The implications for Canadian astronaut David Saint-Jacques will likely be significant. Our CBC crew caught up with him outside of Moscow, actually training for a ballistic descent just a few weeks ago.
You're concentrating on your breathing, how comfortable you are.
He's due to fly in the next Soyuz rocket on December 20th. But Russian space analyst Vadim Lukashevich doubts it's possible to do an investigation and still keep that timetable. If it was somebody's mistake, they'll fix it, he says, and will continue to fly, a month or two delay. If it's something more fundamentally wrong with production, it could be longer. That means an indefinite stay for the 3 astronauts already on board the International Space Station and a need to replace them. No one can afford the Soyuz rockets to be out for long. They're the only way up. Chris Brown, CBC News, Moscow.
Now, someone who knows very well what all of that must have felt like is Chris Hadfield. As you'd expect, the retired Canadian astronaut has loads of insight. I caught up with him earlier today.
So take me on board that spacecraft, what those 2 astronauts were seeing, hearing, but also thinking and doing.
During a launch, there are a few critical moments. One is as you go from one set of rockets to another, from the first stage to the second stage, you're really focused. As that was happening, the vehicle started shaking wildly, and you could see there was a deceleration. So the crew's like, okay, we got a serious engine problem. They're looking at the displays, they're getting out the manual controls, they're digging into the checklist, making sure they're going to follow all the next steps. It's something you're hyper trained for. You're super aware. Nothing else in the universe matters but what's right in front of those guys. That's what they were thinking.
And how much control do they have in that moment?
You can take over and fly the thing manually all the way to Earth. In fact, that's what we trained to do. I was trained on my flight to fly it back all by hand, this big controller. But if you just put it into ballistic mode, if you just let it sort of lob itself back to Earth like a ball, that's eventually, it's a little higher force on the body, but it's simple. That's what they did.
So the crew on the ISS, what is their thought process now? Because they're weighing all their options. They're not entirely cut off, right?
No, their ship is docked. They can come home anytime they need to if they have an emergency. But that ship won't last forever up there. It's got things in it that can only be certified for so long.
There's a lifespan of their capsule up there.
Yeah, it's got fuels and things in it that don't last forever. Also, the longest anybody's ever been up is like 14 months. I think they're up there for the long haul.
Would they leave? Is that an option?
That's a big deal to abandon ship. I don't think they'll abandon the space station unless we absolutely have to.
Would the ISS, be able to survive, or do they need to have that daily maintenance?
Well, it's sort of like any ship at sea. For a little while, it'll keep going by itself, but all machines break.
Always good to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Now, if the Russians aren't able to get the Soyuz fleet back up and running, that would be a big problem because NASA's space shuttle replacement, the Orion, is still years away. The agency has given billions to private aerospace companies to help fill the gap, but they're not ready yet either. NASA had hoped to start using 2 different spacecraft by mid-next year, Boeing's Starliner capsule and the Crew Dragon vehicle from SpaceX. There have been setbacks, and that timetable looks pretty iffy. The Crew Dragon's first manned test flight has been bumped from April 2019 to June, while the Starliner's first flight with people on board has also been rebooked from early summer to August. Still, NASA remains cautiously optimistic that one or both will be ready for manned missions to the ISS by the end of next year.
Parts of the Florida Panhandle are in ruins tonight, transformed from a beachy oasis to a disaster zone in the wake of Hurricane Michael. It is now a tropical storm headed for the Atlantic, leaving a trail of destruction behind it.
It was horrible. I've been through storms before. This was the strongest, harshest storm I've ever seen.
Michael is blamed for at least 6 deaths across 3 states, a number that's likely to grow. About 950,000 homes and businesses are without power. Most are in Florida, where entire neighborhoods are flattened. Early projections suggest it could top $19 billion and take years to repair. And picking up the pieces won't be easy. As Paul Hunter tells us, many residents are shell-shocked.
Take a moment to absorb these images. Mexico Beach, Florida, after Hurricane Michael. 2 days ago, a tiny tourist town east of Panama City, home to about 1,000 people, now in near absolute ruin. Those who live here stunned and in tears.
It's pretty devastating. Like, everybody we know lost their house. Everybody. And our jobs.
The winds were so fierce and surging waters so powerful, those who stepped out for a first look at the aftermath today seemed barely able to make sense of it.
Oh God, Panama City, there's nothing there, nothing. I never seen nothing like it, nothing. It was sad. Where are people gonna live?
Governor Rick Scott toured parts of Panama City today.
You survived, huh?
I survived.
Where were you? Were you in the
22.
Were you in it?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
He urged people to beware. It's still dangerous out there. There are thousands of fallen trees, downed power lines, and that debris from all those obliterated buildings.
Ocean to water. That's our section.
Emergency crews, meanwhile, searched for all who defied evacuation orders. In Mexico Beach, nearly 300 people refused to leave before the storm. Many remain unaccounted for. Still surveying what's left of her neighborhood in that town, Emily Hansen.
My friend that I work for, that's her house. It's pretty much destroyed all the way up into the 2nd floor. And then we have a person right there that we know, that we're very close with. Their house is completely gone.
Like so much of this stretch of the Florida Panhandle, it was blown apart and washed away. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Washington.
And Michael's not done yet. The storm is moving through North Carolina and Virginia tonight, packing powerful winds and drenching rain. Parts of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland could see heavy rains tomorrow as the last of Michael blows past.
Now we're taking you back to Myanmar, a country facing international scorn for driving out more than 800,000 Rohingya Muslims. It's been called a genocide, and it happened under the watch of a controversial figure. Aung San Suu Kyi is the de facto leader of Myanmar after decades under house arrest. Her persistent calls for reform won respect abroad and an honorary Canadian citizenship, but now she's lost both. Nala Ayed shows us how that plays at home.
After skipping the UN General Assembly, Aung San Suu Kyi is at relative ease in the spotlight among regional friends. In a rare interview there, she seemed to take on others who may be growing less friendly.
I don't care about the prizes and honors as such. I'm sorry that friends are not as steadfast as they might be, because I think Friendship means understanding, basically.
She didn't mention Canada by name or the decision to revoke her honorary citizenship. But Myanmar is bristling at international criticism, the military rejecting allegations of genocide, and Suu Kyi refusing to acknowledge she's let so many down. But here at home, she has many defenders, like Aung Tun Tet, on the government's panel investigating the atrocities, and an honorary professor at the University of British Columbia.
We need to be conscious of the realities in Myanmar, with all these complexities, and she herself is doing her best to navigate and to find the best solutions and the way forward.
Suu Kyi leads a fractured country, fresh from conflict and military dictatorship. Yet she must still share power with the military. There is also a strong ultra-nationalist voice and widespread belief Rohingya don't belong here at all. And yet, even among those who believe none of that excuses her apparent indifference, there is also the belief she's still the best place to lead. This Burmese Muslim served on another commission on Rakhine State.
She has made a lot of errors. She has made a lot of blunder. But show me a person who can take her place for our democratic goal. She is our only chance.
Among ordinary Burmese, she's revered for what she gave up to lead. I feel sorry for her. She's caught in the middle of the trouble, says Sote, a taxi driver. Critics should come and see rather than judging from a distance, says this hotel worker. But the government must also improve on press freedoms, he says. Suu Kyi's reputation abroad withered further when 2 Reuters journalists who investigated a massacre of 10 Rohingya were tried and convicted. Dozens have also been charged under a law critics say is increasingly used to quiet dissent.
They have a majority in parliament. They could amend these laws, and for someone to be held up as an icon of democracy and moral leadership, she certainly doesn't appear to deserve it anymore.
Once an icon of resistance, the lady may have fallen from international grace, but she's still a local hero. Nala Ayed, CBC News, Yangon, Myanmar.
This week brought a discouraging sign of where things stand in Myanmar. 3 more journalists were arrested for reporting on irregular public spending. They're charged with causing public fear and alarm. The Committee to Protect Journalists said using colonial-era laws to silence independent journalists undermines Aung San Suu Kyi's claim that Myanmar is transitioning to democracy.
And we are watching several other developing stories on The National tonight, including important issues in an appeal case that drew a crowd at the Supreme Court of Canada. Protesters outside made their views clear as they gathered in support of Cindy Gladue. She was a 36-year-old sex trade worker found dead in an Edmonton motel bathroom in 2011. She'd bled to death from an 11-centimeter wound to her vaginal wall. The man accused, Bradley Barton, was acquitted, in part because Gladue was said to have consented to rough sex. Today, 15 interveners asked the court to consider the treatment of Indigenous women in the justice system.
The lack of respect and dignity shown to Ms. Gladue because she was an Indigenous woman is perhaps the most troubling of all.
She was objectified and dehumanized, called a specimen, called tissue, called an object.
The case also involves the issue of consent, including whether someone can consent to violence. One of Barton's lawyers, though, argues a new trial would amount to being prosecuted for the same crime twice. The mother of a toddler who drowned in Ontario's Grand River is being charged in his death. Police say Michelle Hansen failed to stop at a road closure sign and drove right into that fast-flowing river. 3-year-old Caden Young was swept out of his mother's arms while they tried to escape from the car. Hansen is being charged with impaired driving causing death, dangerous driving, and criminal negligence causing death. And it was another day of losses on North American stock markets. The S&P TSX Composite fell just over 200 points, settling into its lowest level since April. While in the U.S., the Dow plunged almost 546 points, and the Nasdaq down almost 93. Energy stocks saw the biggest decrease, but gold got a big boost. Investors perhaps hedging against uncertainty.
Still ahead on The National, at issue. Less than a week away from legalized cannabis, the gang talks the politics of pot.
Plus, the moment inside the White House that grabbed international attention. Kanye's conference is our moment.
And an emotional interview with Gord Downie's brothers as they get set to reveal a documentary based on his final project.
We're gonna keep building, keep maintaining the legacy. That's our job, and he left it to us for good reason, because we really care.
It is heartbreaking to think that by the time my children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, are in their 20s, elephants, rhinos, and tigers might well be extinct in the wild. I, for one, am not willing to look my children in the eye and say that we were the generation that let this happen on our watch.
Prince William speaking today at a conference on the illegal trade in animal parts, a market so lucrative, it's one of organized crime's main sources of income. The CBC's Margaret Evans reports on the problem from a place the poachers can't reach.
Chester Zoo near Liverpool, doing its best to give visitors a kind of safari feel, into the wild, if you like. The reality, of course, is quite different. But this zoo has become critical in the survival of the eastern black rhino. There are only about 650 still alive in the wild, their numbers decimated by poaching, and now potentially dependent on their brethren in captivity for survival.
The situation in the wild is so dire now that actually all individuals are really important.
There have been 3 new births at the zoo in just over a year, bringing the total number of black rhinos to 11. Proud mamas and babies, always a draw. The Chester Zoo also takes in animals recovered alive from smuggling rings, like these rare sun bears, rescued as cubs from poachers in Cambodia, now parents to their own baby.
I think some people don't quite understand this is organised crime in the same way that drugs, people, guns are all trafficked, so are animal products.
The illegal wildlife trade is now the 4th most lucrative in the world for criminal gangs. Rhino horns, for example, worth staggering sums on the black market. And an estimated 20,000 elephants a year are still being slaughtered for their ivory.
One of the worst things I saw in Border Force, 110 kilos in total. And as you can see, very dirty. Indeed, there's still blood from the animal on that.
Welcome to what they call the Dead Shed at Heathrow Airport, where UK Border Force officer Grant Miller trains customs agents in spotting contraband, from the more obvious to the less so.
The picture is massive. It goes from your tourist who goes abroad and buys a souvenir, perhaps a sea turtle shell, up to completely well-organised, transnational organised criminals.
Unless those networks are shut down, say conservationists, zoos like this one, where they're actively preserving a gene pool, may one day be the only place future generations have a chance to see some animals on the edge of extinction. Margaret Evans, CBC News, Chester.
Still ahead on The National, Gord Downie's brothers speak nearly a year after his death, why they are carrying on his work.
And apparently I get to promote At Issue again. Just 6 days out from legalized pot, the panel goes green. Andrew Chantal and Shachi Curl are here. That's next.
I think 5 or 6 times in my life that I've taken a puff.
That was then Liberal leader Justin Trudeau back in 2013. An off-the-cuff comment revealed his thoughts on pot a year after his party passed a resolution to legalize cannabis. Trudeau later doubled down and turned it into a key campaign promise.
The Liberal Party is committed to legalizing and regulating marijuana.
Once in power, the government made its announcement on the world stage on a not-so-random date.
We will be introducing legislation in the spring of 2017 that ensures that we keep marijuana out of the hands of children and profits out of the hands of criminals.
But the challenges and concerns were far from over.
This is an artificial date that the government has set. A lot of concerns being raised in the medical community.
That date is now just days away. So, is the country ready?
People are a little anxious about how the thing will roll out.
Whatever happens next week, what are the stakes for the government? So, who better to talk about the politics of pot than At Issue? Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Chachi Kurl is in Vancouver. Okay, let's start with you, Andrew. This was a big campaign promise, so big that I would say it's probably one of the things he'll be able to point to in the next election and say, I got it done. How much is riding on getting this right for the government?
Well, first of all, they got it done and they kept their promise, so that points over some of the other promises they made. There is going to be inevitably, I think, some confusion and some chaos in the wake of this. If you look at what is in train in the various provinces and the various municipalities, there is widespread confusion. There's all kinds of different approaches. People are in different stages of readiness for this. I suspect, unless it's really serious, most people will understand that we are entering in a completely new age. There are going to be inevitable teething difficulties. There's going to be inevitable transition difficulties that will arise. I don't think they will take too much flack for that. But I do think that's going to depend on one thing, among other things, on how much of an increase in usage do we see coming out of this. There is no doubt that we have erected powerful interests now that have an interest in encouraging people to smoke up, not only in the private sector, but also in the government sector. And I think we're fooling ourselves if we don't think we're normalizing consumption of marijuana, and that's going to rub a lot of people the wrong way.
Okay, but the counter to that, Chantal, would be the government is normalizing marijuana in order to try and keep it out of the hands of kids. That's what their argument is, and to shut down the black market. So if that's the end game, is that not worth that?
I'm not sure that all that many people are buying into the official line, keeping it out of the hands of kids, but I think most people who have had any experience with kids or who have been kids know that it is in the hands of kids at this point, so we're not putting it in the hands of kids. I suspect the fallout for the Liberals, when it counts, which is next year in the election, will be minimal because it will be too early to tell. And part of the genius, quote unquote, of the approach to this has been to allow every province to deal with it in the way it saw fit. And at some point, some provinces are going to find that other provinces have better approaches and vice versa. It's going to take a while. But I'm struck by the fact that, as far as I can tell, no party is planning to campaign in the next election on rolling back the clock on this. Yep. In part, I guess, because a lot of former conservative politicians have become very invested in what Andrew was talking about, which is the setting up of a profitable industry dealing with cannabis.
Well, I did talk to a conservative this week who said there's no room really here for them. They're not going to criticize it. They're not going to. It's happening and on they go. So, Chachi, is it a political issue then in any real sense after next week?
It's definitely the risks, I think, and I would beg to differ a little bit, outweigh the rewards for the Liberals on this. The rewards have already largely been collected. They came in the fall of 2015. Hey, I'm going to do this. People showed up. They voted for him. Those younger voters, particularly who were motivated to come out and vote for the Liberals, are they going to do so again, or does he now have to pull another rabbit out of the hat or another promise out? In the meantime, to Andrew's point around that confusion, the confusion can lead to anxiety, and we're already starting to see that. It's funny, all this national anxiety over something that's supposed to mellow us out. But for the most part, Canadians are skeptical as to whether or not it will be kept out of the hands of kids. Point taken, it's already in their hands, but it will continue to be in their hands in the minds of many Canadians. They're not necessarily convinced this is going to be an economic boon to Canadian societies and communities. They're not convinced that law enforcement is going to be poised and ready to deal with people driving high. And so when you have all of those small anxieties, they can have a tendency to sort of blow up. And that is where the Conservatives are poised on the law and order to file to say, hey, we don't have an issue with legalization, but you've botched the rollout.
Chantal wants back in. Go ahead. Yeah.
One, I think the rollout and the rollout issues will largely come back to haunt provinces and not the federal government, because clearly that is where the action is. Two, I was at the convention that voted for this resolution when the Liberals were in third place, and I was struck by the fact that a lot of the people who voted for that were parents and not the young Liberals. And part of the reason is, yes, there will be anxiety, but it will be balanced by the loss of the anxiety of having your teenager or young adult facing a criminal record for having gotten caught taking a toke on a Saturday night. So bottom line, I have not seen it be an issue in any provincial election. We have a government here incoming that is going to raise the age to 21. That is not even a big issue outside of public health circles, and those circles are saying, do not make that age higher because you're not going to kill the black market. But it's going to take more than the next 9-10 months to the election to see the real fallout from this policy.
Okay, last word to Andrew, and on that point about the time, I mean, we can't expect this to be hunky-dory as of next Wednesday. It will take some time to figure it out and for people to get comfortable with it too.
That's right, and as I say, different provinces and different cities are in different stages of implementation. In Ontario, they're not going to have private stores open for another 6 months, for example. I do think that, on one issue that Chantal raised briefly, one measure of whether this is a success or not is the degree to which they're able to push organized crime out of it and eliminate the black market. The C.D. Howe Institute just came out with a study suggesting that demand is likely to outrun supply so much that the black market is in real danger of flourishing rather than being eliminated. So that's something they're going to have to really look for in the next 6 months to a year is, do you actually push crime out of it? We want to keep it out of the hands of kids, but we want to take it out of the hands of organized crime, and I'm not sure we're there yet.
Although again,
there's a lot of skepticism on that.
Yeah, and I was going to say the same. If people who are used to buying it on the black market, they may not make the switch right away, so it may take time to see whether you can measure that within the first year. Okay, I just want to switch gears if I can quickly to get you some thoughts on Stephen Harper's new book. Whether you've read it or not, I just started. He's been out courting the U.S. media and I would say focusing on conservative leaning media largely. Andrew, you've written about it today. I don't know if you've finished reading it. It's not very long. What is your reaction to him? And this is his big sort of foray back into public life in some ways, I guess.
Well, there's some validity to it. I think that to take the positive part first, he's right to say that American conservatives in particular got locked into a very doctrinaire, dogmatic, congealed in 1980 version of conservatism, and they're not really addressing the problems of today. That's fine. I'm not so enamored of his analysis of populism and of the Trump supporters. I think what is really the case is he himself, Harper, happens to agree with Trump on a series of issues, on immigration, on trade, on nationalism. But he doesn't want to say that he agrees with Trump, so he says, well, I agree with his supporters, and you conservatives, you should have listened to them. Well, maybe they shouldn't, maybe they shouldn't have, but the reason why Trump has attracted so much support isn't really for his views on trade or these kinds of things. It's because of the cultural wars in the United States and the particular representation of people who feel left out by the media, looked down upon by the elites, and that sort of thing. It's not really an economic base at all. So I think it's kind of a self-serving analysis that allows him to defend a lot of the things he did in government, which strayed very far from conservative orthodoxy, as not being unprincipled or expedient or making it up as he went along, but really he was just sort of populist before its time. That's convenient, but not particularly persuasive.
Okay. Chantal.
I have a really hard time equating Stephen Harper, the persona that we saw in office for 10 years, with populism, even good populism. And I have a real hard time with his analysis of society, as in people who can work anywhere and people who are in their communities, and the notion that people who are more mobile, more cosmopolitan, have less attachment to country and values. That is not how debates, for instance, about the future of Quebec have played out, where so-called cosmopolitan and so-called average people who are attached to their communities have connected on an issue and on a dream. So I found it really interesting, more for what it said about Stephen Harper, who remains a bit of an enigma to many of us after all those years, than about what it said about Canadian society.
Okay, 1 minute for you, Sachi, to react to that as well.
So I think what struck me was his commentary just on political discourse. And he says, you know, we need to be less dogmatic. We have to be more empirical. Hey, I'm a data person, so yay, let's all be more empirical. But this is also the person who injected the word crazy repeatedly into conversations about policy, particularly around oil and gas. When we look at the roots of the tweet wars on climate change or on immigration, where you've got leaders on the left and leaders on the right really talking more to their bases than trying to reach across the divide and convince people of the rightness of their way or the way they're proffering, yes, some of that has to do with what's bled from south of the border. Yep. Some of that's had to do with what's bled from overseas. But you know what? The roots also go back to the stringent and strident messaging that we heard out of the Harper Conservatives over subsequent mandates and several elections. And you know what? You reap what you sow, and I think we're reaping a little bit of that dogma that we now hear being decried in this book.
Okay, good book reviews, everybody. I'm going to keep reading mine. Thank you. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content. This week, we're talking former Governor General Michaël Jean's bid to stay on as the head of the Francophonie without support. Government support, anyway. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/The National.
Well, this weekend on The National, something different. We brought a group of Canadians together for a face-to-face discussion about legalizing cannabis.
I feel excited about legalization of cannabis.
I've been waiting for this day for so long.
I feel like it's a really important step forward for our society.
I'm worried that
the distribution will cause people to head more towards dealers.
That the government will interfere with Indigenous right to self-regulation.
That after legalization, marijuana will become too expensive.
There is a lot of unanswered questions.
I have questions.
I have questions.
I need answers.
I need answers.
I need answers.
They had a chance to pose those questions directly to our panel, including Federal Minister Bill Blair, Dr. Gigi Osler, and cannabis lawyer Kirk Tusaw. Make sure to catch that Sunday night on The National.
Still ahead tonight on The National, our moment of the day. Kanye West steals the spotlight with a 10-minute speech during his lunch at the White House.
If he don't look good, we don't look good. This is our president. He has to be the freshest, the flyest planes, the best factories, and we have to make our core be empowered. We have to bring jobs into America. He said, I'm tragically ill. Come on, just let's go. She kind of bit her lip.
And that is Choir, 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 performing earlier tonight in downtown Toronto, led by members of the Tragically Hip. Next week will mark 1 year since the band's leading light, Gord Downie, died from a rare cancer at just 53. Before his passing, he took this country on a profound journey. Despite the toll his illness was taking, Downie took on an epic project. The Secret Path is a multimedia story about Shawnee Wenjack, the 12-year-old Anishinaabe boy who died of starvation and exposure in 1963 after running away from a residential school in northwestern Ontario. With his brothers, Mike and Patrick, at his side, Downie launched a national tour, culminating in a concert that reached nearly 12 million Canadians on CBC platforms. Tomorrow, CBC Television airs a documentary by those brothers on all the passion and emotion of Gord's last year. Tonight, they tell us all about it.
I think he just knew how important it was. I think he knew that his voice would be heard. He saw it as something that I think made sense to him as his life was coming to an end.
Freezing rain and ice helmet walking home.
But yeah, why he would want to take that on with everything he was dealing with, I'm still kind of in awe, you know, to be honest with you. By the time that rolled around, Gord himself had already, been diagnosed with cancer, several rounds of treatment. I mean, you can see how exhausted he is. And I guess knowing him a little bit, you can also just see how much it means to him.
That's the part I like, that real hammer piano thing.
You know, Patrick and I, Patrick especially, you know, saw what it was like for him just to put in a day. And everybody knows that, who's got a family member, you know. It's pretty hard to get through a day when you're going through whatever the treatment is, whatever you're doing. But that last part of his life, yeah, very proud of those decisions he made.
So we made a record. This is the book that was made for it. I think ultimately it's meant to really cast of these schools, to really speed it up, to get it out to a lot of people, you know, now.
I think the doc does a really good job of certainly capturing, you know, what Gord was trying to achieve and how respectfully that was received, and the kind of partnership I think that was, you know, established certainly with our family and with the Wenjack family.
I'll think about you guys always. I always will. And I'll think about your brother.
Gord was never afraid of the tough stuff. Never afraid of the tough stuff. The unpleasant conversations, you name it. And this is, you know, reconciliation. That's the tough stuff. And it can be paralyzing.
And when something occurs in your heart, and there isn't a next sentence.
For an artist, I don't think there's any higher achievement than creating a piece such as Secret Path that both has full artistic merit and also could be a catalyst for, you know, the kind of change that, you know, so many people want to see in this country.
She said can't go into the woods without them. I smiled at her and left.
Yeah, just seeing all those unguarded or just real moments with Gord, that always gets me. Well, watching the doc, I have a good cry on Friday night when I watch it, I'm sure. I watched that film and it's the same feeling I had the first time I heard Gord on the radio. That's my brother, you know. It's just pure pride, so.
I really do love the details that he pulled out. We're gonna keep building, keep maintaining the legacy. That's our job, and he left it to us for good reason, because we really care. You know, Gordy is, what can I say, you know? My other brother's sitting right here. I can't say he was the best, but we loved him. Still do.
Secret path. There's no secret path.
Gord left so much behind, and he taught us so much along the way. His kindness, his thoughtfulness. Those are the kind of things you really hope to be carrying with you always.
Finding the Secret Path airs tomorrow evening on CBC Television at 9 p.m. local time, 9:30 in Newfoundland. So right now, let's hear a little bit more from tonight's public tribute by choir, and members of the Tragically Hip. Have a listen.
There's a lot of hype around today's meeting between Donald Trump and Kanye West, two big personalities sitting down in the Oval Office for lunch. And Kanye West, he delivered something. Surrounded by cameras, he gave a long, rambling speech. You know what? Take a listen to some of what he had to say. We can unpack it after that. Here's our moment.
When I put this hat on, it made me feel like Superman. You know, I love Hillary, I love everyone, right? But the campaign, I'm with her, just didn't make me feel as a guy that didn't get to see my dad all the time, like a guy that could play catch with his son. There's a lot of things affecting our mental health that makes us do crazy things that puts us back into that trap door called the 13th Amendment. I did say abolish with the hat on because why would you keep something around that's a trap door? Trump is on his hero's journey right now, and he might not have expected to have a crazy like Kanye West run up and support. I brought a gift with me right here. This right here is the iPlane 1. It's a hydrogen-powered airplane, and this is what our president should be flying in. Look at this, Jared.
And so, boy, I don't know if you could actually see it in that shot, but when he's accessing his phone, he actually types in the password to his phone, and it just happens to be 60000 the whole way through, and that became a big deal online. But Rosie, I don't know if I can actually do what you promised and unpack what he said. It was really hard to follow. I listened to it 3 or 4 times, trying to listen to the substance of what he was saying. It was meandering, to say the least.
Yeah, it was very uncomfortable. It was 10 minutes. This was a meeting that was supposed to be about opioids and the criminal justice system. Neither of those conversations actually happened, and I think a lot of people spent a lot of time looking at Donald Trump's face.
The most interesting thing was to see Donald Trump that quiet and give up that much spotlight to someone else, because I think you're all right. I think he didn't know what was happening, and frankly, neither did we. Anyway, it was a moment.
Yeah.
That's the National for Thursday, October 11th. Good night, everybody.